Hello to all the listeners of the Right Mind podcast, the podcast produced by the Institute of European Right, a think tank based in Vilnius. My name is Teodoras Žukas, and joining me in the studio today is my colleague Laurynas Peluritis.
Hello.
In the Right Mind podcast, we discuss various topics spanning from political theory to international affairs. I'm delighted to introduce our guest for today's podcast, Dr. Paul Monku. Paul Monku is an Australian author, scholar, expert, commentator, and beside other things, a poet. Paul Monku authored a dozen books covering topics ranging from international affairs to China, Western civilization, and authoritarian regimes. Paul Monku is a regular contributor to the Australian press, addressing various issues, and has several years of experience teaching Chinese politics and strategic affairs in leading Australian universities. Additionally, he has served as an intelligence analyst for Australia's Defense Intelligence Organization. Mr. Monku, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Theodoros. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Our conversation will center around China, international security, the Indo-Pacific region, and the challenges posed to the rules-based international order. My first question, first of all, looking to your intellectual CV, one can notice that your expertise and intellectual activity is very broad. How do you manage to combine so many intellectual interests that span from deep analysis of Chinese domestic politics to writing poetry?
Well, let me answer that as succinctly as I can, and then if you wish me to expand, we can explore further. From a very young age, I was a precocious reader, and I was interested in a lot of things. And when I finished secondary school, I wasn't satisfied to just go straight into a profession. And I started to build up a personal library. And by the time I headed off to the National University to do a PhD, I had 3,000 books. And my youngest siblings have said for years that as they grew up, they're much younger than me, that library was mostly in a family home, and they would walk out and say, look at this book's on everything. Mm-hmm. The second component of it is that in order to broaden my horizons, I did an arts degree in European history, ancient, medieval, and modern, by the end of which I wanted to do a PhD or graduate studies in the US on international affairs more broadly. And I ended up doing a PhD at the National University and chose as my topic US counterinsurgency strategy throughout the Cold War in Southeast Asia and Central America. And that, of course, was started from scratch. I hadn't done international relations or American foreign policy as an undergraduate. But I finished the PhD just as the Cold War ended and joined the intelligence service, and they assigned me to work on China, Japan, and Korea, so I had to start all over again. Mm-hmm. And after 6 years in defense intelligence and getting to head the China desk, I discovered that neither the Defense nor the Foreign Affairs Department was prepared to develop me as a China analyst. And so I left government service and reinvented myself as a lecturer initially in Chinese politics and strategic studies, as you said. But after a few years, I collaborated with an old friend to set up a consulting company in applied cognitive science. And we worked with clients on decision theory and judgment and hypothesis testing and so on, and nothing whatsoever to do with China or European history, except insofar as that was the history of philosophy. Along the way, I always aspired to be a poet. And I've always attributed that to watching Dr. Zhivago when I was about 18 years old and thinking, I'd like to be like that guy. And as a matter of fact, I'm staying in Riga with two very dear friends, and we watched Dr. Zhivago again the other night. And last year I had a book of poetry published called The Three Graces, Companionship, Discretion, Passion. And I held up the book, and this was a private party at my place for about 20 old friends. And I said, you all know that I've wanted to be Yuri Zhivago ever since I was 18. I am. I am. I've done it. And I said, and I've got one big advantage over Yuri Zhivago is he's a fictional character.
Yeah. So what are the other readings and books that you love the most besides Pasternak?
Well, there is another which goes back to my childhood that I think had a big influence on my wanting a broader, encompassing understanding of the world and wanting to be a poet, and that's Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. It was read to my class when I was in 5th grade, and it made an enormous impression on me. And I've since read it to young nephews and nieces when they were children, and I've always said that reading The Lord of the Rings didn't incline me to live in fantasy world. it just showed me in that particular book what an overall view of a world in space and time, with its different languages, its different cultures, its history, its different peoples, its own poetry, might be like. And I thought to myself, what if one had that kind of synoptic view of the real world instead of just Middle-earth? And that's what I set out to get.
Just a second on poetry. Which poets do you find that were an influence to you, or you sort of aspire to sometimes, maybe, as not role models, but maybe that you would consider the sort of the best poets in your taste, in your opinion?
Yes. There's quite a few. As a matter of fact, on the flight to the US and in New York, the book I was reading was a new one by Robin Land Fox called Homer and His Iliad, which is a splendid piece of work. But the Latin poets, Catullus, Virgil, Ovid, were a big influence. Dante, Shakespeare, Yeats, Tennyson, Wordsworth, certainly Shelley.
Western canon.
Yeah, the Western canon, really. And in fact, the great thing about this recent experience, and I've written this in the preface to a forthcoming book of poetry called Red Ochre for the Moon Goddess, is that Rachel, my current muse, brought the whole Western canon to life. She's an extraordinary woman, and she speaks English, French, and German. She reads Latin. She's extraordinarily well-read, and there seems to be nothing that I can refer to over 3,000 years of Western civilization that she doesn't know about. It's just amazing to me. And I could sing her praises for half an hour. Mm-hmm. But that's come at the right time, because although I'd written poetry before I ever encountered Rach, she uniquely wanted poetry from me. She approached me. It wasn't me getting sight of her and thinking, wow, and writing poetry in the hope that she would be interested. She knew I was a poet and she wanted poetry. And so I've written for her in about 2.5 years some 450 poems. It's just been a gold mine. It's been the most amazing experience. So, yeah.
Yes, I'm glad that you mentioned Lord of the Rings, because for one thing, I love that book too, and the other thing is that I am sure you will agree that it has a lot of political and philosophical ideas within the book.
Yes, as a matter of fact, this links to our main theme, because a year or two ago I wrote a piece in the national press saying that we had various voices in the country saying China basically is going to become the dominant power in the world, and we just have to accept that. We can't beat it. So I wrote in the press that this was the voice of Saruman, and we needed to listen to Gandalf.
Okay.
Yeah, and since you made this smooth transition to China from Lord of the Rings, I think one of the questions right now is that maybe over the last 2 years, the narrative is starting to slowly shift. Like, everyone was talking, China is the next superpower. They're going to be the dominant force in the 21st century. Now everyone is becoming more skeptical because they're facing economical problems, but also the demographical situation appears to be quite a bigger predicament for the Communist Party than everybody expected. Everybody expected there should be sometime a slump, but maybe not so early and not so dramatically. So now there's more change in how China is starting to be perceived, not only as this rising power, but maybe dangerous power that wants to overreach while it has resources to do that.
Yes. It's almost as if you're citing Hal Branson, Michael Beckley, Danger Zone, yes. And they make precisely this argument that it's increasingly clear, if you're looking closely, that China has peaked, and that for a number of reasons, past about 2030, it's going to face very serious internal problems. And therefore, we need to move rapidly to deter it from the use of force, from doing anything reckless before 2030. And if we can do that, we might get to a situation where it will, because of the constraints on it, become a little more tractable. But it's worth saying in that context that not only do I think that there's a lot to be said for that, and indeed almost 20 years ago in my book Thunder from the Silent Zone, I made roughly the same argument that too many people, it seemed to me, not only in Australia but globally, were projecting China's growth almost indefinitely into the future and hoping or even assuming that as it grew, it would develop a large middle class, and the middle class would push for greater civil rights and political freedoms, and China would do what South Korea and Taiwan and in a different way Japan had done. And that being the case, what was not to like? And I cautioned in my book that while no country had grown at that rate indefinitely, and therefore one was to assume it would slow, there were in any case a number of other potential scenarios which we needed to consider very carefully. So I called that first scenario the mutation scenario. And it was broadly what Bill Overholt used to call the East Asia model. It was pretty clear that Deng Xiaoping and the others had looked at South Korea and Japan and Taiwan and Singapore and said, well, they're getting something right that Mao clearly got wrong. We need to learn from them. And as they opened up and investment started to pour in and the private sector started to take off, I think Bill and many other people thought, okay, this is good. But even Bill, who was a great enthusiast, even after Tiananmen, he said, Deng is our man. Back him. Don't get this wrong. But a few years ago, he published a book called China's Crisis of Success, in which he said that the Communist Party had in fact balked at the ongoing opening and liberalization that would be required to see this process through, and that this was of some concern. Xi Jinping has, in the years since then, of course, made it increasingly clear that party monopoly of power and an ideological vision were the priority, not growth and certainly not democratization. So we're in that territory for sure. But the other three scenarios I spelled out in that book, and I got a second edition of the book published this year in order for it to be more widely available. I said we have to consider the possibility, first of all, what I call the maturation scenario, that China's economy would reach a plateau and that it might well get old before it got rich, that if it reached a level of GDP per capita, which, while much greater than previously, was still actually well below that of Taiwan or South Korea, then it would perhaps keep its nose above water, but it would face considerable challenges, even in terms of fiscal allocation of resources. A third scenario I said was militarization, that as the country grew richer, the party would be tempted to invest large sums of money in military modernization and perhaps the exercise of military force. Well, we've seen that happen. It's a common consensus that China has undergone the largest and fastest military build-up in peacetime in possibly ever, certainly in recent history. The fourth scenario, I said, is metastasis, a scenario in which the party's inability or unwillingness to undertake the reforms that would keep the system supple and give it buffering against crises could lead to an implosion of the regime. And the fact that the party has invested even more in internal security, surveillance and censorship than in its military is a pretty clear sign that it feels that too. So we're in very interesting territory with China in the decade ahead.
So you would argue that the party, the Chinese Communist Party, they see this threat, economic threat and social threat quite objectively, and they react to that?
Well, I'm not sure I'd use the word objectively, but I think that, let's say, they look at it through ideological lenses. They're aware of a number of the trends that are emerging. But in the same way that let's say, Stalin was aware in the 1920s that if the NEP was persevered with and an independent peasant agriculture flourished, that Russia would drift back towards capitalism. And indeed, it might have been a very good thing. But he decided, no, we want to produce communism. And to do that, we need to do two things. We need to collectivize agriculture, not only because that heads off the development of a proto-capitalist class, but because, pardon me, we're being frozen out of capital markets by the Western world. Revolution hasn't taken place, and so famously he said, we've got to develop socialism in one country. We need an investable surplus for industry. And so it was to be extracted from the peasantry. And as Robert Conquest said many years ago, forced collectivization arguably is a way to achieve industrialization, but likewise, cannibalism is one way to achieve a high-protein diet.
Yeah, exactly. Especially bearing in mind that, well, the result was that for a very long time, until basically the collapse of the Soviet Union, it became a grain importing rather than exporting country. Like when you have, all the rich, soil in Ukraine and southern parts of Russia where anything grows, like you just throw a seed and and it grows almost overnight. To have famine and to import grain is ridiculous. But that was the result of Communist Party politics.
Yes, I mean, if you're prepared to starve the peasantry as Stalin was, then you could get away with it. But if, like Khrushchev, you're saying, well, we want people to believe in communism, you can't go starving your peasantry. And so they began to import grain rather than reform the system. And eventually Gorbachev and others said, well, the system's broken. What are we going to do here? But what he found was that after 70 years of that kind of regime, there was no easy path to a market economy. And because Eastern Europe and the Baltic states hadn't been quite so long under the heel, and they had, despite efforts on the Stalin's part to destroy civil society in a place like Poland and indeed the Baltic states by executing or deporting tens of thousands of people, they had deeper roots, and so they were able, after 1991 anyway, or after 89, to reconstitute themselves in a productive way. And I must say, just in the past few days, having passed through Tallinn and Riga and come here, it's just electrifying to see the transformation. And likewise Poland. I mean, it's just, and my wife, I was talking about my muse earlier. My wife is Venezuelan. We haven't lived together since 2007. She's back in Venezuela. We're great friends, but she wanted to do something for her country, and then she realized she was gay. So we became friends instead of marital partners. But she's committed to Venezuela, recovering from the Chavistas, and she was terribly keen to come with me to Poland and the Baltic states, and wasn't able to. But I've been sending her photos and telling her what I'm seeing, and she said more than ever, I've got to come to these places. You'll have to bring me. She calls me Frodo Baggins, by the way.
Okay, Frodo Baggins. Coming back to China's aspirations, regional aspirations. At the Singapore summit 6 months ago, both the United States and China's defense secretaries said virtually the same thing, that the war between the United States and China is not inevitable. But what it means, that the war is probable. What would be your assessment of how dangerous the security situation is currently in the larger Indo-Pacific region?
I think it is dangerous for at least two reasons. One is that China's capability and its sense of prepotency have grown very fast in the last 20, 30 years. And its clear perception is that the US is in long-term relative, if not absolute, decline. So the danger is there that they will overreach, that they'll misperceive the danger of the US pushing back, and they'll think, no, the US will back away. And there are people in Australia, one of whom is an old friend of mine who runs the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute in Sydney. He's recently published a book called The Echidna Strategy, in which he argues that this is in fact the reality, and we in Australia have to assume that the US will not stand and fight. It will pull back in the face of Chinese pressure, which will leave us having to fend for ourselves. And we should prepare against that and not kid ourselves that we can fight China. We need to develop a purely defensive strategy that he believes would deter China from actually invading Australia, but which would only to a very limited extent constrain China's domination of the Asian region. So it's, I've written a very critical review of the book and said, that's a distinctly dystopian future. And I've also made the point that if he was right, you would expect that some leading analysts in South Korea, in Japan, in Taiwan, in the Philippines would all be saying much the same thing. They'd be saying the US is not going to stay. We have to rethink everything. But that's not what they're doing at the moment. They're talking to Washington and saying, okay, let's buttress the situation here. And Japan has said, we attach great importance to Taiwan and we would almost certainly intervene if it was invaded. And South Korea wants to join the Quad, So I think that just as NATO has been standing up to Putin but needs to take the next step, So the AUKUS agreement and the Quad are signs that in the Indo-Pacific, the democracies are saying, so far and no further, don't rush the fences, Xi. And my sense, I should add, and I said this in New York, is that Xi has become the puppet master is probably too strong a term, but he is aligned, of course, with Putin and with Raisi, with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and they, between them, want to see the end of the Pax Americana. They want to push America to the point where, due to dissension within the United States, due to being overstretched militarily, the US pulls back and says, we can't do all of this. And Xi, at the moment, appears to be playing it very cannily. He's saying that he supports Putin, but not by way of intervention. He appears to be aligned with Iran in terms of what it's doing in the Middle East. And in fact, recently published a map of the Middle East which showed no Israel, which is an ominous move. And it's my understanding that Hamas used Russian and North Korean ammunition in its recent razzia, its savage attack on southern Israel. So the gist of what I said in New York is that for me, it all clicked into place when Biden sent the Eisenhower and the Gerald Ford into the Eastern Mediterranean, and suddenly you see this is a global chessboard. This is not a set of sort of brush fires in different places. And you can see that Xi Jinping in Beijing is saying, well, let's press America, and to invade Taiwan anytime soon, not urgently. What I want to see first is that the US is overstretched, that it's driven by internal dissension, that maybe we get an isolationist president, then we can move. So it's a very interesting state of play we've got.
And what would you think in terms of China's calculations if they would to be about to reach a decision to make this kind of a radical step, for example, regarding the Taiwan? What do you think? What is the essential variable for that kind of decision to be reached? Is it then some internal turmoil? Or is it as you said, the broader chess and broader geopolitical calculations that China is considering?
I would say that it's always been the preference of the Communist Party to win this battle without having to go to war, right? And anybody who reads this knows that he says, the greatest victories are those in which you don't even have to fight. And we saw how they maneuvered to bring Hong Kong to heel. They now know, or they surely know, that offers of one country, two systems to Taiwan cannot possibly seem credible. But I suspect they're hoping that the DPP will lose the forthcoming presidential election and that they'll have a president whom they can try and cut some kind of deal with. And they want to induce Taiwan to, at least at the political level, to conclude that in the long run, they don't really have any alternative but to bow to Beijing. If they can do that, then they don't need to invade. They just need to slowly change things. And the question is, if they stick to that strategy, given that so far that's been a losing strategy, what would the rest of us do? And I think the answer is we keep talking to Taiwan. But do we get to a situation where countries increasingly say, look, we're jack of this whole game that Beijing's playing. We see Beijing as hostile to the global system in the same way that Putin is, even if he's playing the game a little differently. And so we're going to recognise Taiwanese independence. Well, Xi's always said, well, that would be a red line. Well, fine. But if you've got a well-aligned set of wealthy democratic states saying we're in this together, China's got to think very hard about whether it goes to war over that. Whereas so far it's hoping that it can bluff its way by saying, as she said to Biden the other day, reunification's unstoppable. It's inevitable. Concede defeat. Stop arming Taiwan. That's the way Communist parties always work. They assert that they're on the right side of history, that their victory is inevitable, and that any sensible people knows that. And that's why when anybody talks about containing or criticising, they say that's Cold War thinking. Well, they're very much involved in the Cold War and have been for years.
The interesting thing is, of course, I think, especially in Taiwan, the sort of the quelling of the mass protests in Hong Kong was a very big wake-up call, because up until that point, well, there were a lot of illusions even in Taiwanese society. Well, maybe we can come to some sort of agreement, move closer, and there was a lot of Chinese capital investment in Taiwan as well. So, there's economic relations there, which are very strong and quite, influential in political circles as well. I think exactly the Communist Party of China changed their approach when they went down really hard on Hong Kong, and they changed the perception about them. And does that mean that they will change their sort of broader strategical outlook into a more aggressive sort of posture?
Well, it's clearly what they're developing the capability to be able to do. And one way to look at this is to say during the Cold War, the Soviet Union developed formidable military forces. And did the West go to war and say, oh, well, we're going to lose the Cold War? There were some people who feared that we might if we didn't stay alert. But broadly speaking, we did. And we came through that really very well, you'd have to say. The only thing is we didn't quite finish the job. And, of course, at the same time, China was reforming and opening. And so altogether too many people said, oh, well, it's just fine. I mean, if you look at the organization I worked for in the early 90s, the Defense Intelligence Organization, 10 years before I took over the China desk in 1994, there'd been 20 analysts on the China desk. By the time I took it over, there were none, because the judgment had made a high level of China's reforming and opening. What's not to like? We've got a thriving, rapidly growing economic relationship with it. We want to be friends with it. Reassign the analysts. And so when I took over the desk, A, there'd been nobody at all on the desk for 6 months, and B, there was a pile, literally a foot high, of secret intelligence reports that nobody had read, because there was nobody there to read them. And I had to reconstitute the whole operation from scratch. And as I quipped to your national security advisor a couple of hours ago, it sounds rather grandiose to say I was head of the China desk in defense intelligence. I was the China desk.
Okay.
But there's now 40 analysts on the China desk in India.
Since Mr. Monk, since you're from Australia, I think we have to ask a question about Australia's posture and role in all the things that we're considering in this podcast, and generally about the regional security issues. Does Australia, as certainly one of the largest states in the wider region, see China plainly as a threat? And what is the general discourse in Australia or on international security, both in Indo-Pacific region and, if I may add, on those global turmoil points that we have? Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, and of course Hamas attack on Israel and Israel's retaliation on that.
So the short answer is that we have been having a debate in Australia for at least 20 years over how do we choose between, or do we need to choose between, our greatest security partner, the United States, and our greatest trading partner, China. And I need hardly say that a considerable body of people in the business community have said, well, it's pretty clear which side our bread is buttered on. And if we're friends with China, we don't need the United States. We're not insecure. There have been others who aren't in the business community as such, but who have said Australia needs to grow up and develop a more independent foreign policy, by which they clearly mean talking to China on our own terms and believing that we can make a difference as a middle power by speaking on our own behalf instead of simply on behalf of Washington or in Washington's cause. But it's very clear from public opinion polls that since Xi Jinping took the reins of power, trust in China and concern about it has plummeted in Australia. And of course we know that that's true around the world, and certainly in the Western democracies around the world, because of the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, which some fool in Beijing seems to have thought would intimidate people, had the opposite effect. So we've now got an active debate because on a bipartisan basis, declaratory policy is we're clear that we are hanging in there with the Western Alliance, and the statement that we're going to acquire Virginia-class and new British AUKUS-class submarines is a very substantial signal. We're also in the market for a number of other advanced weapon systems that go with the AUKUS package. There are critics of AUKUS, but the Labor government has said at a declaratory level from day one, we align with coalition policy in that regard. What they haven't done, however, and it's a bit like Scholz's Germany, is having made that statement, they haven't yet at least put their money where their mouth is. And so the growing concern is that maybe they think that just by making a statement, they can push the can down the road, kick the can down the road and not have to expend the resources. And as you will both be aware, this is an issue with many NATO countries, right? Everybody sort of says, yeah, well, Putin's a problem and it could get worse and we probably should increase defence expenditure, but with 2 or 3 honourable exceptions, that's not happening. And I know that, people I've spoken to here and people I've spoken to in Poland are concerned about that. So the view in Australia is, at an official level, it is bipartisan. At a countrywide level, there are clear divisions of opinion about what we ought to do and about what shape the future is likely to take. And Sam, who wrote this book, The Echidna Strategy, I mentioned earlier, arranged for a copy of his book to be sent to me to read and review. And when it turned up in the mail, I told him, and he texted, I look forward to being defenestrated. And I drafted a critical review, staffed it around a few, professionals, and the consensus was, yeah, you've defenestrated him, but in the nicest possible way.
And would you agree that and what would be your take on Australia's take on those, as I said, the global turmoil points on Russia's war against Ukraine and Hamas attacks against Israel? Does Australia sees these points as some kind of a wider phenomenon where authoritarian regimes or terrorist groups supported by authoritarian regimes are starting to very seriously question the international, rules-based international order?
I would say that's very clear on the conservative side of politics. Anthony Albanese, as Prime Minister, has made statements which suggest that he broadly does see it that way, which is why he visited Ukraine and why he attended the NATO summit in Madrid. Penny Wong, as Foreign Minister, seems a little more equivocal, but she did go with him to to Tokyo for the Quad summit, and there are more or less, I suppose you could say, subtle differences regarding China's role, Russia's role, and Hamas. So Penny Wong is among those who, while not defending what Hamas did, has not been altogether sympathetic to Israel. Albanese has been more sympathetic to Israel, but there is a tendency, it seems to be, on the Labor side of politics to tacitly align with these numerous protest groups around the world that are saying, well, Hamas did what they did because they're fighting an anti-colonial, war. So that's, and I don't think it is seen, as certainly I see it, as part of the bigger strategic picture. It's seen as, well, that's just what happens because Israel has done what it's done to the Palestinian Arabs. And even with regard to Putin, there have always been people in Australia who said, well, it's NATO's fault. They picked up the Kremlin line and said if NATO hadn't so aggressively expanded eastward, and you have to keep saying to them and to the broader public, NATO didn't aggressively expand eastward. All these countries that used to be under the Soviet thumb have said to NATO, can we join?
Absolutely. Just
as Sweden and Finland did after the invasion of Ukraine. And for Putin, it ought to have been a very sobering lesson that he says, I demand that NATO pull back its 1997 borders. NATO declines to do so, invades Ukraine, and Finland and Sweden, which have been neutral forever, say, let us in. To me, that was a really encouraging outcome, actually, of the war. But now we need to consolidate that. And similarly, in Asia and in the Pacific, that Shinzo Abe really initiated in conversations with Narendra Modi and then with Washington and Canberra, the Quad. That was encouraging. But there is no NATO in Asia yet. AUKUS is a bold initiative. What it needs now is to be bedded down. And in fact, the people I've been speaking to here today have taken the interesting line that what is needed is a global NATO. We have a former Prime Minister in Paul Keating who made the extraordinary statements very recently that NATO is an aggressive force, that allowing NATO into Asia would be like inflicting the plague on Asia. He said, what was the expression he talked about? That Europe more generally, he said, is a historical disgrace because they've fought wars forever with one another. It's a violent continent. It was an extraordinary outburst, which almost as if he was giving them from talking points given to him by the Chinese Communist Party. And I wrote a blistering piece in response, an op-ed in the national paper, saying somebody needs to send Mr. Keating back to grade school for a basic history lesson. He's clueless.
Because, well, of course, NATO has been the opposite, a stabilizing force. And I also would like to point out to those listeners who don't know that, for example, Australia sent Bushmaster vehicles to Ukraine, which performed very well on the battlefield. Like, they've been really tested in utmost hard conditions. So Australia is also taking part in what's happening in Europe. So maybe the whole idea of a more global democratic military alliance is not so unfathomable and not so unpractical as some people might say. But a small point of intervention about NATO expansion and so on. Yeah, Lithuania, we begged to join NATO. Yes. That's the truth. But I think a lot of people overlook. It was 10 years ago that the protests in Kiev, in Maidan Square, started. But they started not because of NATO. They started because Yanukovych, he reversed his public decision, which he had promised to the Ukrainian civil society, that Ukraine would be on the way to join the European Union. And that it's very strange that EU and the broader idea of Europe as a political and cultural sort of community has been completely out of the equation. Nobody talks that actually joining the EU was the issue why Ukrainians went to the streets, went to protest, and why the whole conflict started. Nobody in Ukraine really wanted to join NATO that much. It wasn't a popular idea.
At that point, yes.
Yeah.
And my understanding, I think it's Serhiy Plokhy in his book on the Russo-Ukrainian War who wrote this, was that Putin made clear to Yanukovych that joining the EU is a no-no and that he would start throwing punches if Yanukovych did that, and Yanukovych went to water on it. It's an interesting story in itself. So yeah, I agree, and it seems to me what people lose sight of, particularly when they talk about China as supposedly the emerging hegemon, is that if you take the EU and the United States and Japan and South Korea and India and Australia and Taiwan, so you put them together, they're far wealthier and more advanced than China, or China and Russia together. And Iran makes no difference in the scales. And that was broadly why the Cold War was won. It wasn't simply that the US had a big nuclear arsenal. That was important as far as it went. But it was that the US had on its side every significant, wealthy, developed and democratic state in the world. And the Soviet Union had only poor, indigent allies who needed aid from it. China's in a similar situation. It doesn't really have very many friends in the world. Even many of those countries that are taking its Belt and Road money are realizing that this is almost like another form of colonialism, and Chinese are hard to deal with, and they don't really provide jobs because they send Chinese laborers to do the work, and they get you in debt, and then they're not like the World Bank. They're not very forgiving. So I think we need to move these levers, and part of the conversation I've had with three leading figures here today is around not appeasing Putin, making clear to Putin that what he's done is simply not acceptable. It's not negotiable. And running, it seems to me, at the same time, the line that the rest of us respect Russia. I made this point many years ago, shortly after the downfall of the Soviet Union, that we needed to think through how we drew Russia into a new framework of security and trade, because leave aside the Communist Party, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, Turgenev, these are figures broadly conceived in Western literature. They're great writers. Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, these are wonderful composers. We don't see them as some alien culture. That Russian religion was a form of Christianity. The Russian czars were named for the season, not the Khans. So the idea that Russia was an outsider needed to be rethought. But I heard the then head of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Francois Heisbrook, in 1992 or 3 at ANU say, Russia is not part of Europe. It's not wanted as part of Europe. It's simply not clubbable. And I actually violated the Chatham House rule by writing an opinion piece in response to that, because I thought this is really important. And I wrote, Russia, by any meaningful criterion, culturally, is part of Europe. The question is how to draw it out of its communist past and its Slavophilism into a European order. We need to feel our way. But if we say to the Russians, bugger off, you're on the other side of a wall and never mind that the Communist Party's gone, we don't see you as brothers, as clubbable, then we risk a nationalistic reaction in Russia that could be nasty and unpleasant to deal with. And then a few days after it appeared, I was introduced to the counselor from the Russian embassy, and he said to me, "That was a wonderful piece of yours." The ambassador drew it to my attention and said, "This goes to the heart of the matter." That was right at the start, well before Putin. So I still think what we need to do is run those two lines, which is in effect that the kind of regime that Putin runs, we will not coddle, we will not really negotiate with, that his violation of clear undertakings about the borders of Ukraine and other states on his periphery will not be accepted, that he will exhaust his country running up against combined NATO resistance if he perseveres in that, and that the only regime that will be welcomed into the global order is a post-Putin liberalizing regime that renounces those imperialist objectives. And if that takes many years to achieve, so be it. We did it in the Cold War. We can do it again. Russia's much weaker than it was when it was the Soviet Union.
Yeah, absolutely. We usually say this, that currently the things are being decided in the battlefield, and there is not much need for us to articulate on possible future of Russia, because now things are being decided in the Ukrainian front. I think we can, as we started with poetry, we can end with poetry. So I know that you have a certain poem prepared for you to read. So we would be glad to hear that. You can make some intro or context into this poem.
Okay, I'll try not to rustle the paper too much. I know that it can.
It's okay.
Sound a bit odd in the recording, but the poem is called Spartan Music. I may have mentioned that earlier. And I was asked by my polylingual muse to write a poem about war, precisely because of the things we've been discussing. She's very literate, but she's also very interested in world affairs. And she specifically said, would I write a poem called Spartan Music? So I pulled off my shelf a book on the grand strategy of classical Sparta. I checked a few historical facts and then wrote the following poem, the gist of which, as your readers will or listeners will gather, is that what's going on in the world stirs me, as it does many others, to want to resist. But I'm an old man. I'm not a young warrior, and I've never been a warrior. I've always been an intellectual, an intelligence analyst. So it can't be my job to take up arms. And neither should it be my job simply to sort of join a clarion call for arms to be used as such, but rather to think really hard about what are we facing, how do we do this. And so here's the poem. Spartan Music. Do you know the piece by John Stuart Mill, published in the Edinburgh Review, on George Grote's monumental history of Greece and on the Grecian heritage? Mill wrote the piece, aged 40, on the bit, and he declared the true ancestors of the nations of the European West to be not Celts or Germans, but the Greeks. The epic clash at Marathon, he claimed, even with regard to England's past, had been more important in the large than Hastings and the fateful Norman conquest. Writing in our time, Paul Rea declares that only one thing may be said against Mill's claim, that Marathon was no more than a skirmish compared with battles of a decade later. Thermopylae and Artemisium, Salamis, Plataea, and Mycale were the major victories against the Persian menace from the ancient East. David, Rea wrote, so crushed Goliath, importing from the Hebrew book of Samuel a simile of giant-killing valor, as to preclude the Persian king's return. I dare say you're acquainted with these wars, and that, although we're so much heirs of Athens, you're conscious of the role the Spartans played, if not at Marathon, then afterward. Which, I gather, is the reason why, as Moscow's forces rape the wide Ukraine and Israel goes to war against Hamas, you summon me to think on Spartan music. It must be said I'd never make a hoplite, nor have I, by custom, marched to pipes, the oloi of the heavy infantry, or songs of war to terrify the foes of Sparta's famous, fearsome formations, in the days that Mill and Rea laud. And yet, the grim atrocities of Putin's killers, Gaza's Islamists, would have your aging poet march to war, if only he were capable of arms. What else but war can now avail to venge the brutal devastations they have wreaked? But I was never raised a Spartiate, classified a paius and subjected to regimes of exercise and dancing, the poetry or war songs of the polis. What I've done is seek to comprehend the roots of revolution and of war, to master what a mind and pen can do in mitigating all man-made disasters. Is it now my work as writer, poet, to play the aulos on the flank of troops, to orchestrate the condign use of force deployed against the enemies of peace? I sense you urge on me just such a role, where the war is righteous and our arms surely must prevail, lest anarchy be loosed upon the world, a darkened time. But I am a man of nuance and of scruple, conscious of the maxim Nietzsche wrote, when fighting monsters, ware lest you become one. The abyss you gaze into gazes back. Ah, music, and the pipes of war, the shield Achilles bore depicted all, two noble cities and the need for arms. Yet his heroic cause was pure destruction. Let me sing the truth while I still can. Whatever comes to pass, that is my call. Not least now, being an old man, I'll strive for good, and only for it fall.
Brilliant. That's quite brilliant.
Brilliant, thank you. And, connecting all the dots through, global and Western history from Athens, Sparta, Persia to our times. And it's been quite an insightful hour, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I just want to remind you that our today's guest was Dr. Paul Monku, an Australian author, scholar, expert, commentator, and beside other things, a poet. This was the podcast, The Right Minds. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.